Okay, so once I'm made the host, we can get going. And I just realized I need to get one thing. All right, so as everybody filters in, hi. We're about to get started in just a second. Hello. Hi, everybody. So, for everybody just joining us, I am super, super, super excited and honored to have the amazing, legendary composer Christopher Theofanidis joining us today. Hi, Chris.
Hey, Ben. Great to see you again.
Great to see you, too. So that first clip was a movement from a piece that Chris wrote called Karoo, for two flutes, obviously. The whole thing is three movements. That was the first movement. And I felt like it was appropriate to open with that because that was sort of my own introduction to Chris's music. And I was just so blown away by it and captivated by how imaginative and inventive it was that I knew I had to reach out to him and meet him. And here we are. So before we get started, I want to just remind everybody that there's a Q&A feature somewhere on people's screens, and you can use that if you have questions, and we will get to as many as possible. And also you can use the chat function, and we will field, like I said, as many of those as possible throughout the hour. I want to thank our partnering restaurants, which are the Hendrix Restaurant and Bar in Laguna Niguel, Toast Kitchen and Bakery in Costa Mesa, Provenance in Newport Beach, Haven Craft Kitchen and Bar in Orange, Descanso Restaurant in Costa Mesa, and Adia in Irvine. I feel like, so I won't make you do it yourself. If you don't mind, I'll give a brief introduction of sort of your background, Chris. So Chris, like I said, is amazing, and he has had his works performed by groups like the London Symphony, the New York Philharmonic, the Philadelphia Orchestra, Atlanta Symphony, the Pacific Symphony. He was the composer of the year for the Pittsburgh Symphony, recipient of literally every prize known to man, including the Rome Prize and the Guggenheim Fellowship. He's been nominated for 2 Grammy Awards, one of which is for his bassoon concerto, which I highly recommend everyone check out because it's amazing. He has taught at the Peabody Conservatory and the Juilliard School, and is currently on faculty at Yale University and co-director of the composition program at the Aspen Music Festival. So I'm amazed you have time to even be here with us, but that's amazing.
I've got nothing but time. You know, this is like one of the funny things. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day, and I said, well, is it okay, can we chat again at some point in the future? And I said, when would be good? And he said, well, you know, July's looking pretty good. August isn't bad either. September's pretty open. So, you know, that's the way it feels like. But I'm really super delighted. I'm particularly happy to see you again. It was such a great kind of experience we had working together, both on the recordings and the premiere and everything else. And it was great. You know, you're the only person I know who could pull off that red suit.
Oh my God. Well, I don't know.
I was thinking about that like the whole concert. I was thinking, how can he wear that? And it worked so well.
Well, thank you. I feel like I've been in a t-shirt and shorts for the last 5 months. So yeah, the idea of putting a suit on is pretty horrifying to me.
Right.
Yeah. So, and what Chris is talking about for everybody out there is that, basically, Chris and I worked on a commission together for flute and piano that Chris wrote for me and my friend Jennifer Shao on piano. And we premiered that just about 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago in Los Angeles on the same concert from what we just saw. And we also ended up recording the piece along with some other amazing solo flute pieces that Chris wrote. So it's a really cool experience. So just sort of to start at the beginning, I'm always curious with composers, like, how you first get into composition, because I feel like it's a pretty clear path for performers. Like, you start your instrument when you're young and there's sort of a set path, but how, like, did you start as an instrumentalist and then transition at some point?
Yeah, you know, I mean, it's funny, I've thought about this a number of times, and I'm hesitant to admit it, but I think, you know, composing often starts from bad performing habits. So like, I would be sitting there at the piano practicing the piano, and about, you know, a half an hour into the practice, my mind would drift, and I'd start noodling around and improvising and that kind of thing. And it's funny that impulse to kind of improvise and to kind of do things which are outside what's there in front of you is often, you know, the pathway into composing. And I did that. I, you know, played piano and oboe for a number of years, and, you know, can still get around a little bit on the piano, but it's kind of faded. It's distant history. So, but you know.
Yeah. So, at what point did you sort of feel like you made that leap to thinking like, okay, I really want to pursue this as my serious sort of musical goal?
You know, I think the impulse to write music without thinking of myself as a composer came from just hearing pieces which just blew me away personally as a teenager. Hearing Gabrielli brass canzone, the Mozart Requiem I remember loomed large in that period, and hearing that and just thinking, wow, I can't imagine what that would feel like to hear something you did like that come back at you. And then, fast forward to my second year in college, and I kind of started to treat composition as a serious path. And but that kind of awakening came from just loving music on my own, not being told that this is good or that's good, but just kind of discovering it for myself.
Yeah. Was it scary, like when you first started composing? Like, I feel like the idea of putting out something that you've created entirely yourself might be a little bit, like, especially at first, might be a little bit of a daunting idea.
Oh, it was incredibly daunting. I mean, the first people who asked me to write pieces for them were my high school. I mean, I was in college already, but they were in my high school chorus and band. They actually asked me to write pieces for them. And, when you get in front of a chorus of 50 people, who are singing your piece for the first time, and you never had this experience before, it's like somebody shining a gigantic spotlight on your face and saying, look at him, So it's a little bit unnerving. And it's funny because composition is kind of, it's in some ways like a humble thing, because you're really behind the scenes all the time. You're not ever out in front like a performer is.
Yeah.
And so it is kind of a funny thing, but the people that you're out in front of are the performers, the people who are actually playing the pieces, and you realize that that's kind of what it's about, is creating that energy with the people that you're writing with and for.
Yeah. Well, and I'm curious also, like, I feel like with a lot of composers that I know and have worked with, it seems like at a certain point they sort of evolved into what sort of becomes their particular voice or sort of their style. Would you say that there was a period of time where that really sort of crystallized for you, or was it more of a longer evolution?
Yeah, that's a funny thing, because it's kind of, you think what you're becoming is one thing, and maybe what you're becoming is something different. And when I look back at the things which I think kind of define what my voice is, what I think of as my voice, they're very specific things. It's the love for me of certain kinds of harmonic language and sonority. A fourth in a major chord, that interval is so powerful for me for some reason, like physically. Certain ideas, like I remember hearing, I played in a woodwind quintet for a number of years, and which I loved, but that's a disparate ensemble. You have 5 very different voices, and it sounds like this is a solo, this is a solo, this is. And one of the things that I remember thinking, and it actually started right around the time of this piece, Karoo, that you played, was the idea of heterophony, the idea that lines are so interlinked that they become one thing, one organism, and how beautiful that was as an idea. And that became like a thing for me for the rest of my life. I became interested in like finding the way of making an organism out of many parts, and like the human body, its complexity is not one system, it's all the systems interacting together that make that so amazing. And that's where the thrill is for me.
It's really interesting, because that is also what I was really drawn to the first time I heard Karoo, was this idea that you have 2 flutists, but it's almost impossible to distinguish where one ends and one begins. And you almost get these sort of like super flute effects where it's like something that one person could never do on their own, but with 2 sort of weaving in and out. It's really interesting, especially like in the, well, I guess in all the movements, but in the second movement in particular, I really think it's interesting. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of the background of how that piece came about?
Yeah, I mean, I was a student in my doctoral program and at Yale, and my friend Karu Hinata asked me to write her a solo piece. So I started off writing a solo piece, and I just couldn't make it work. It's one of the hardest, I think it has to be one of the hardest compositional tasks to write a solo flute piece. That's really a strong work, it's really hard. And so I after some time working on this piece, I went back to her and I said, I'm really sorry. I'm admitting failure. I can't do this. Is there any way we could at least add one more player? And she said, well, one of my closest friends is Chris Veneman. He's a wonderful flutist. It'd be great to have a 2 flute piece. And I remember playing when I was, a oboe player, all these wonderful Telemann duos and really loved the sound of duetting voices. I thought those were the most amazing things. So I took my, stab at it, and at the time was interested in this heterophony and the idea of one mind, of many voices coming together in one mind. And that, didn't look back from there, but that piece came directly out of that experience. And the second movement you mentioned is inspired by shakuhachi playing, the Japanese flute, which is so breathy and airy and has a very particular vibrato and so amazing. And it was great fun to try to get at that in concert flute.
Well, it's just like one of the most fun pieces to play. I would play it forever. And for anybody who's interested, the whole performance of that, from the performance we just saw and various other ones, are all on YouTube, and maybe we can convince the symphony to post it on the social media so people can see that, because the other movements are amazing. So just sort of as a general philosophy, I'm curious, when you're composing, how much are you concerned with sort of creating music that is sort of philosophically sound for you, versus how do you balance that with something that people are going to really connect with and want to listen to? Because I feel like there was definitely a trend in the middle of the 20th century to sort of lean more towards writing music in a vacuum and not being so concerned with the reaction of audiences. And I feel like in a lot of ways that has taken a turn. I'm curious, is that something that you think about as you're writing, or do you just write what you want and it just...
Yeah, I mean, it's a funny thing, that the idea of being self-conscious in a way of like, an audience. But one of my favorite people for composition is Stephen Mackey, he's on the faculty at Princeton and is just a wonderfully interesting composer and has an amazing sense of timing and physics in his music and everything. And I once talked to him about this. They said, who are you writing for anyway? It's just like coming from another planet. Are you writing for Martians? And he said, no, I'm writing for an audience of 1,000 me's. That is, and I really like that answer. Like, actually, you're better off writing in a way for your true sense of delight and depth and whatever is important to you artistically, and hoping it radiates out to some people who are interested in it. Sometimes people have said that like the music that I've written has been very direct and, direct. I mean, it's communicative in that way. And so they think that maybe I'm thinking about the audience in that way. And I'm genuinely not. I mean, it's what I'm interested in hearing and writing. And I think that in the end, a creative person kind of has to go in that direction to be honest.
Well, just as a listener and a player, I think that, I find your music so interesting because it's not like anything I've ever heard. It's very unique voice, and something that's like a different sound, but to me, it does resonate, at least with me and with, from my anecdotal polling of other people, with a lot of people. So I think to me, that's what makes it really special. So we have a couple questions sort of about your process. We had one question about who I was playing Karoo with. So just to go back to that, that was the amazing flutist Johanna Borenstein, who's a flutist in LA who sometimes plays with Pacific Symphony. So it's really fun to put that together with her. So Amira wants to know what instrument you use to compose, or if it's all done in your head.
Yeah, my background is mostly as a pianist, and I still write mostly at the piano with a combination of kind of singing and playing. And that makes sense to me. And more, even though I'm less and less graceful in life, I actually kind of tend to kind of dance more and that kind of thing as I'm writing. So I have a sense of movement and the way phrases go around movement when I'm actually composing. And so the physical nature of music is something that I use a lot too, like how things can dance and be balletic in phrasing.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Do you use, like, when you're writing music, are you doing it at the piano, or are you doing it, like, do you use music notation software as you're composing, or is that sort of something you go back and input?
Increasingly, I do. I mean, what up until a few years ago, what I was doing was kind of doing a hybrid thing where I would write short score, very quickly and kind of jot on manuscript paper. And then at some point, later in the day, I would actually put that stuff into Sibelius, which is the program I use. But you know, now I'm kind of, I feel pretty good about going directly into the music notation software.
Yeah.
Some things I like to work out on still by hand, but yeah, it's made life infinitely easier. I remember back like in the late 80s and early 90s when I started really composing, that you know, you develop this amazing callus on your, you know, from just a month of copy work, you know, for an 8-minute piece, you'd
Wow.
be like, you know, hours and hours of that kind of thing. And I just, you know, it's still every once in a while I'm just amazed, you know, pressing the extract button from a score and getting 30 parts, you know, kind of clumsily, you know, notated, but you could still update it and do it, you know, edit it well. I mean, that's just an incredible thing. It just makes you, you know, tremble thinking about what the past masters would have done, you know, with that. If Mozart or Rossini or any of those people would have had a crack or Bach at that, I mean, it could have changed. It could have, you know, quintupled the output.
Yeah, yeah. The productivity would be through the roof.
Yeah.
It's interesting. So at this point, you know, now, you know, you're such a well-known composer, well-respected composer. How much, like, in terms of your workload and your composition load, how much would you say you're just choosing to write on your own versus are commissions from specific people?
Yeah, it's interesting you asked that question. This is actually something that's just come up really recently. You know, first I would say I had a colleague for many years at Yale named Ezra Latterman who passed away at the age of 90, but he basically for the last 25 years of his life only did the pieces he wanted to do and found homes for them basically to do them. And I increasingly feel like that's a wonderful, really great route. I mean, I've done commissions basically from my mid-20s to now in my early 50s is kind of the way I've gone. But actually, right now, I've been starting a project with two wonderful collaborators, a poet named Melissa Studdard and a designer named Ann Patterson, to do a kind of semi-staged oratorio on Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha. And
Oh,
that's a
wow.
project which is a labor of love. I mean, we're all, you know, infatuated with this story, and it's kind of a story for the moment, actually, in a weird way, this kind of personal sense of awakening. And that's totally led by us. We're not doing it waiting around for commission. We're making the project happen, and then we'll find a home for it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And in terms of when you're writing, like, well, I guess this would apply whether you're writing on your own or as a commission, but when you're writing for an instrument that you don't play yourself, how do you learn to write idiomatically? Is it sort of trial and error? Are there certain instruments that are harder to figure that out for than others? Like I would think like writing for classical guitar, for example, might be a particularly tricky one versus, you know, the piano or the flute or something.
Yeah, I mean, the great secret is that if you have enough friends, they'll tell you when you're doing something wrong. that actually really helps a lot. Like, you know, I mean, and also when we worked on the character etudes, one thing at a time, I mean, there were things in there I just knew were clumsy and, you know, I didn't know what they were. And you were able to show me exactly like, look, this is what happens when your auxiliary fingers are, you know, freaking out and doing this stuff. And I mean, that actually, that's the way you learn a lot of it. I mean, I played oboe, so I know, you know, a couple of things about woodwind playing that are particular to woodwind family instruments. And I played the piano and I played trumpet a little bit and I played very bad violin. So I kind of knew some of what the issues were. But, you know, I think one of the things one of my teachers once told me was, you know, imagine when you're writing that note, looking at that player and physically seeing what they're going to do. And it's such a different mentality. I mean, I think composers, when they start, are so in their heads that they're not in the physical acoustic space of where the sound is actually going to come from. And that's been a great way to think, because I want to see somebody in a well-tailored suit, you know, just kind of playing as if they're saying that thing.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, you know, that's the goal in a way. And I think you learn a lot along the way, and I think if you're observant person, you can learn a lot of things about what's idiomatic, what's not idiomatic. But then you always keep an open line with performers who you're working with.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think it's great also because it's sort of a symbiotic relationship when there's that two-way street between the performer and the composer. And I don't know, because I feel like, you know, you were talking about these character etudes that you wrote that we recorded together, and yeah, like maybe there were certain things that just were going to tie my fingers into knots. But then I know there were also many things that maybe at first glance I looked at and I was like, no, that's not going to work. And then, you know, just through sort of sheer terror and trying to get it, like I realized, oh, actually you can make it work if you just sort of do this or that. So I know I learned a lot from sort of having those conversations together and working through that recording process.
Well, I think, you know, it brings up a good point though, which is that, you know, sometimes the musical intention can carry the technique a little bit. Like if you have something that's, you know, has a musical objective that actually feels worthy or whatever, you can kind of, you figure out ways to make what that musical intention or phrase is about come to life. And it might mean, you know, compromises and, you know, things like that in what's written. But I think that you get there together in a way.
Yeah, well, and sort of that reminded me of what you just said about, you know, I think that at least for me, playing new music that hasn't been performed before, that there's no reference recording for, it's easy to as a performer to sort of fall into the idea of, you know, you're trying so hard to execute what a composer's instructions are and that you think their vision is. And it really sort of has to be your voice and their voice together to make it a really compelling product that's going to sort of have a life, you know, as opposed to just trying to do what you think you're supposed to do on it.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. I've often thought, because I mean, I think about what are, you know, how many lessons you learn from being in performance and how your initial intention is just shaped completely, maybe sometimes in a completely different direction, like that bassoon concerto that you mentioned. The premiere performance, the conductor was taking one very large chunk of the piece half speed, and I was like, I was like, please double the speed. This is not right. He goes, okay, don't worry, I'll do it. And then in performance, he still did the very, very slow speed.
Oh, no.
And my face was turning red. I couldn't see straight. I thought it was the end of my life. And then I heard the recording, and I was like, oh, that's what he meant. Okay, I get it. I've since kept that speed. I mean, it's really
oh wow.
It's like, you know, I guess the point is that you're sometimes, even from a creative standpoint, you may not see everything, and when you get into performance, you can see more. And if you're actually not too prideful about it, you can actually, you know, get someplace amazing with other people that you, as a composer. So I was always wondering about that, like, you know, it would be really interesting, people who you think of as very strong-willed, like Beethoven or something like that, what how those things changed in their own music with respect to rehearsal and performance and them listening to other people's ideas and shaping.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. So I imagine it's also really different in terms of performers interpreting your piece when you're talking about like sort of small scale, like a solo or a duo, versus, you know, full orchestra and chorus. Actually, we have someone who asked a question who said that she's actually sung the Here and Now, your piece for orchestra and chorus. So I'm curious, like, do you, is there one that you find more difficult, having either fewer voices to deal with or having lots and lots of voices to deal with? And do you have a different approach depending on which project you're tackling?
I mean, even though those seem like really different tasks, like writing for an 80-person orchestra or, you know, 2 people or something, I mean, I think the goal is still kind of the same, which is to make that organism alive, you know. And you know, if you think about it in terms of the animal world, you know, the way an elephant moves has its own logic and its own grace even, and you know, the way a little beetle moves is got its own kind of logic, and I think that one is not better than the other. One may be bigger than the other, but it's you know, the interest of it could be on a very local level. You just have to look a little bit more carefully. And I think that way of thinking things has made me not feel particularly drawn to one or the other. I mean, I've done a lot of orchestral music. I love chamber music because I actually interact with the players directly in a way that you don't usually in an orchestral situation. But you know, they're all delightful. I mean, if somebody, you know, pulled together 3 tubas and a piccolo and told me to write a piece, I'd be delighted. Trying to figure out what that organism is would be a wonderful challenge and, great fun.
Yeah. Speaking of which, we have a question from our principal double bass player, Michael Franz, who wants to know if you would ever consider writing, or if you have ever written solo music for double bass, or if you'd be open to that.
I certainly would. Yeah, I love it. I would love to do that. I mean, my teacher, Jacob Druckmann, did Valentine, which just, when I first came and heard that piece, it blew my mind. I mean, in the way, how agile bass is and how amazing sonically. And yeah, and I would love to do either solo bass or, ensemble bass, multiple players. I actually had a dream once of writing a piece for 3 contrabasses and soprano.
Oh, wow.
I don't know. It was almost like a forest, like 3 of these marvelous instruments and a singer in the forest or something. And I don't know why that did, but yes, the short answer is yes. I could have.
Okay, we'll connect you guys because Michael's amazing. Chris is amazing. Very cool. And then going back to the here and now, and this question is from Ellen, who said she had the joy of singing it. She says, I'm very taken with the extent to which you create distinctive textures. I had the joy of singing the here and now, and each of the choral movements is astonishingly different and wonderful. Where does this come from? Is this something you plan or just have to try out experimentally?
That's a really good question. And first of all, thank you. And I'm glad that it was so nice to hear that somebody sung that piece. It's actually one of my favorite pieces to have programmed. Because the poetry is by Rumi, and it's for me, the substance of the text in that is something that I actually lead my life by in a way. I mean, I find that work is incredibly important. In terms of texture and that kind of thing, I think it's a combination of, contrast is really important in music. So, there are 13 movements in that piece, for example. It's chorus, soloist, and orchestra. And, one of the models for that, one of the things I think you do in composition is you look at things which resemble what you're going to do to understand things that you like and you don't like. So the obvious one for me in that was Carmina Burana, which is an amazing piece and it gets done all the time. And it's, but there are things in there that always bothered me. One of them is that there are no unaccompanied choral moments. It's just this, big thing, which is cantata, which sounds amazing. So I knew I wanted to start the piece unaccompanied and also to have some unaccompanied stuff in the piece itself. And that was great fun to kind of figure that out. So there are some things that come from just observing textures that work for a particular genre, like this, like choral and orchestra.
Yeah.
There are also some things which I think, I remember one professor of mine when I was in school, it was electronic music professor, and he said we like the first week we were in there, and he showed us a couple of gadgets, and he started to leave the room, and we all said, "Excuse me, professor, what should we do?" And he goes, "I don't know, delight me." And I just, there's something about that phrase really has stayed in my mind all these years, because I think to myself, like, the things that actually delight me are that kind of sonic invention, the things that show, like what the writer said, the singer said, creativity kind of on the sonic level, like what you pair together, what is like surprisingly a brilliant moment versus, a nice moment, what is truly like a superb moment in definition of something versus something that is, that works, but it's not quite as distinctive.
Well, I'm actually curious to talk to you about, I can't remember the term you used for it, but there's a technique that I know you've used in a lot of your orchestra pieces where you create acoustic within the orchestra by having different lengths of different, like, string sections hold different. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I've never heard that anywhere else, and I just think it's so cool.
Yeah, thanks. So that started with that piece, Karoo. I mean, the idea of the heterophony where the lines are so interlinked, but that idea is present in nature, in flocking motions and schooling motions of fish and any number of things. And for me, there's also a little bit of that when you are in a super resonant space. So if you're in a church or something and there's a kind of a stone acoustic, the sound goes on forever. The actual thing that's making the sound stopped some time ago, but the sound continues on. And that warmth of that sound world is really attractive to me. And so, yeah, I mean, basically, you know, it's like taking a melodic line and painting it, and the thing that follows the hand is the glow of the sound that you're trying to create. And so typically, like in a couple of pieces, it works particularly well in the strings, but it also works in the winds and brass and other things too. You foreground a melodic line very strongly. So a melody or whatever, you don't just do it a little bit. Like, it's not just violin ones doing it, it's violin ones and cellos doing the same melodic line. So it's very potent. And then the rest of the strings, for instance, would be Division halves holding single notes within that melody just slightly longer than the actual melody. So it creates it. It's like suddenly it opens it up to kind of an underwater space or a cathedral space or something like that. And the effect can be really, really amazing. I've done that a number of times and in different ways and with different levels of specificity. So how long you hold the tail is really neat, like, and how it plays and that kind of thing, instead of just holding it and stop. You know, you can create really a wonderful sense of that. And so I also, one of my teachers told me one time something which stayed with me. He called writing on a spectrum of wet to dry in texture is something that he thought was really valuable. And he said it's like if you were a pianist and the pedal, the sustain pedal, which creates that wonderful wash, was applied to the orchestra, you know, you could do that same kind of thing. It's orchestra with the pedal down. Yeah. But the other thing is kind of strange is that you have to, like a pianist, you have to have a sense of taste of how much to use the pedal and when it becomes a crutch and not something which is artful. And so you try to find the relationship to that as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just, yeah, like I said, it's such a cool effect. And for anybody who's interested in checking out, I think, for example, your piece Rainbow Body has some great examples of that. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it's based on a composition by Hildegard von Bingen, right? So it's sort of, to me, it mimics this idea of the very wet acoustics of a cathedral that you might be hearing that in, and just the way that the strings, when they're playing it, like, are holding different lengths and creating their own acoustic is really magical.
And in that case, the inspiration, the Hildegard Chant, is very particular because she wrote for women. So the lines are much higher than the male kind of Gregorian voices. And so they vault and can do all kinds of things, and they have a lot more mobility than a lot of, you know, when you have a lot of men singing down low acoustically, it gets kind of thick sounding.
Yeah.
But high, it has this thing. And so that was also quite a nice thing to kind of go with the bright sustain. Yeah.
Yeah, so beautiful. So I'd love to talk for a little bit about the project that you and I, well, you did, and I sort of asked you to do. So for everybody watching, just as a little bit of background, like I said, I came across Chris's music first from the piece we heard at the beginning, Karoo, and I was just completely captivated by it. I started exploring his music and was just like diving deeper and deeper and getting more into all of his different pieces. And I had gone to a performance of the Argus Quartet where they had performed a piece of yours, and just like, it was one of those moments, it was like sort of a cathartic transformational moment for me as an audience member. And I went home, it was like 2 a.m. and I found your email and wrote to you and decided I'm just gonna, you know, see if he'd be open to a commission and writing a piece for flute and piano. Because I had this idea that I wanted to. What?
Did I write you back at 2:15 a.m.?
Yeah, I think something like that. But I had this idea that I was really invested in expanding the available repertoire for flute and piano with, you know, pieces by composers who I really, you know, love their work and respect them. And so that's sort of how we started on this project together. And you composed this amazing, roughly 20 minute work, Lakshmi and the Seat of Divine Desire. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of, when I came to you with this idea, sort of, where did your mind go in terms of starting a project like that? Yeah,
well, first, I really appreciated being asked to write something. And, you know, when you asked me to write it, you said, you know, one of the things I've been thinking about is that there are so many pieces in the flute repertory that have a lot of multi-movements that are shorter and that kind of thing. You know, would you consider doing something longer? And I love that idea. I mean, do it like a single movement that's 15 minutes rather than, you know, 3 movements that are 5 or 5 movements that are 3 or something like that.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of the starting point. And also I'd been really, there, you know, things kind of are confluences that come together and you're not sure why they're circling each other, but they end up in a piece. For this one, I'd taken a trip to India and was in northern India for about 2.5 weeks. And, you know, that was quite an amazing thing. And, you know, all of you can't escape Hindu deities and also Islamic figures, in fact, in northern India. But Lakshmi was a figure that kept coming back, and I really somehow was drawn to that. And then, you know, there's all of this in the Rig Vedas. There is all these wonderful hymns that are it's the oldest religious text in the world, and there's a hymn to creation, and it talks about how creativity starts, with a seed of desire. And the seed of desire is the beginning of creativity. And so those two things kind of came together in the title. And the language of the piece is built around a very particular scale called the acoustic scale. So it's like, if you know music, it's C, D, E, F sharp, G, A, B flat, C. And the F sharp and the B flat make a very seductive, kind of alluring scale in a way. And you hear that, in fact, in the beginning of the piece. It starts right off with a melody that's kind of based on that acoustic scale. And so that kind of threads the piece. And I don't know, those things kind of somehow came together in a vague, poetic way, and the piece was born there.
Yeah, well, we have a clip of it that I'd love to play. But sort of in going with this, I think there was a sort of a relevant question. So Amir wants to know, with your music, are you generally trying to tell a story, like a specific story, or is it more an inspirational sort of affect?
That's a good question. You know, I'm certainly open to the narrative aspect of music a lot, and I think narratively, basically. But I also think of, you know, kind of the creative thing happening around launch pads, meaning that, you know, you might start off with a story, you might start off responding to a piece of art, or you might start off responding to a poem or whatever, an architectural structure, you know, but at a certain point it becomes its own thing. You know, it's the starting point is one thing, and then it has to have its own logic. So I found myself actually quite trapped if I make too thorough of a plan that has to do with storytelling or anything. And, you know, at a certain point, I know when to kind of break from it, or when I'm okay letting it have its own new logic for what it is.
Yeah, interesting. Well, I think it'll be interesting, especially as people listen to this piece, because I could sort of see it going both ways. Like, in a way, it does seem to have a very interesting narrative flow, but it also just has this amazing sort of sound world that it drops you off into, that I think is really just interesting, just to sit and just sort of see where that takes you. So this is a clip about the first 5 minutes from Lakshmi and the Seed of Divine Desire. It's from the world premiere in May of 2018.
Great to hear
There
you.
we go. First 5 minutes of Lakshmi. That's also on YouTube for anybody who wants to see the whole thing. We had a question on Facebook, just going back to what we were talking about before with the piece based on the chant by Hildegard and the title of that, and that is Rainbow Body, correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. So for anybody who wants to check that out, that would be how to find that. We had a question also in the chat that was something I wanted to talk with you about anyway. And that was, have you ever written for an organ like the one at Segerström's concert hall? If so, was it just the organ or with the symphony? Has Pacific Symphony ever played it? And the answer to all of those things is yes. So can you tell us a little bit about the composition that you wrote for the symphony?
Yeah, that was a truly amazing experience. I mean, first of all, you know, I think even knowing music, you don't really fully appreciate what an amazing thing an organ is. You know, Carl asked me to do a kind of shortish piece, 8 minutes, for Paul Jacobs, who's, you know, one of the great organists of all time. And for the inauguration of the Gillespie organ there, that wonderful Fisk organ. And I mean, when I was out there, they were tuning it, and so the Fisk guys were like, "Do you want to come in and see what's going on up here?" And I was like, "Are you kidding? This is like, I would pay good money to do this." And so they took me up all the layers, and I imagine probably there are tours in better times. There are tours of the organ that you can go in. And it's just an amazing thing on the inside of that, you know, all the way up to the very top where the pipes are this big. I mean, they're tiny to the most massive pipes that you can imagine. And when they're tuning it, it's truly something. You're standing there in the middle of pure sound, essentially. So that alone was just one of the most amazing experiences. I decided for that piece to try to the phrase in Latin that comes from you hear in a lot of religious texts is Rex Tremendae Majestatis, which means King of Terrifying Majesty, which somehow seemed appropriate for that particular organ, which so it became the name. And rather than use the full orchestra, I used brass and percussion with the organ. And it was just great fun. I mean, it couldn't have been a more wonderful experience. And I've often thought that could be the first movement of an organ concerto even sometime. You know, there are not too many of those.
Oh, wow.
But the piece has been done probably about a dozen times since then. That was back in, I think, 2008, if I'm not mistaken. And, you know, it's been done some, not a lot, but it does get done. And I think one of the funny things about it is that because it was commissioned by an orchestra instead of a brass ensemble or a brass, you know, kind of, it kind of doesn't travel either way very much. You know, the orchestras aren't keen to necessarily program all brass and percussion ensemble work, but it was a great thrill to do that.
Yeah, well, it's so cool, and like you've got in your background, everywhere. Well,
yeah, that's it.
People can see how amazing this organ is.
Yeah.
And again, if people are interested, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say, you know, you don't realize how tall this is, right? I mean, these are three like distinct levels that you can walk up to the very, very top here and stand on these levels with just, you know, thousands of pipes around you.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I believe there's a clip, I think it might be of the Pacific Symphony. Is it on your website of the piece if people want to check it out?
Oh yeah, like I think there's an audio clip.
Like a couple minutes from it. So if you find Christopher Theofanidis on Google and go on there, you can see what it's all about. Or there are probably people here who are there for the premiere, which is very cool. So I just wanted to talk a little bit, you know, obviously musicians, there's a lot of conversations going on right now about sort of the current climate of things and how, you know, concerts are basically not possible in a live format in a concert hall right now, and sort of how musicians are adapting. And I'm curious how that has impacted sort of your compositional life right now, and does it impact the way you decide what projects you want to take on or start, or sort of how have you been adapting to this?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, nobody's giving up, but it is kind of a theoretical situation that you find yourself in. You know, to write for people somewhere down the line. I personally worry for younger composers, because I feel like, if you've had enough of a time to do this, you realize that there'll be some version of this going forward. But if you're at the beginning of your writing, it must seem pretty terrible. I haven't been writing a lot very well in the last couple of months, in fact. But I've started again, and it's going, knock on wood, pretty well. And I'm much more patient with what I'm writing, which is kind of nice. I mean, I've written some things which feel very vivid to me, but are slow, which is not always the case. Sometimes slow music can really kind of pull you in a kind of way that's not particularly sustainable, but I feel like it's there at the moment. The kinds of things that I'm doing tend to be about the greater field. I'm involved in several foundations. The school that I teach at is, obviously trying to figure out how to handle the fall, and beyond that, the spring, and, how far do you plan these things out? And, musicians play, that's what they do. And so it's an almost impossible situation. That being said, I mean, you mentioned the Argus Quartet earlier, who were originally LA based and I think are in New York now mostly, but they've been doing concerts and they put it all together like this. I mean, the four of them play, they basically lay down each track, playing video. I mean, you've seen these videos, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But it's quite well done. I mean, it actually, they played a piece of mine, which is like a 15-minute piece that I thought they did beautifully putting it together. And there are really inventive ways. People come up with creative solutions, right? So something that seems like a hindrance, like to do that, you have to have a click track, which for a lot of musicians is annoying. Although I guess if you play in film orchestras and stuff like that, you're kind of used to kind of working a little bit with that stuff. But there are flexible clicks where somebody's actually doing the clicks and speeding up and slowing down very organically that you can follow and lay down tracks. So there are a lot of inventive solutions that are happening in this period because of that. And further, for instance, at the school that I'm at, several of the rooms, they're on the same kind of Ethernet system, which has almost no latency. So somebody in like 3 or 4 different rooms can actually do this and play together and it be on. The difficulty is you have to be in the building or you have to be on campus or something like that to actually make that happen. You can't be in LA and, and Long Beach and here. So that, there are some minor things that are happening that I think will be beneficial in the long term too. For this, so
yeah, well, hopefully there's some silver linings in that. It sort of kicks our field into the 21st century, whether we wanted to or not.
That's right.
And you had mentioned when we were chatting that you have a few recording projects that are going to be coming out soon. Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Yeah. The one of them that's coming out, I believe it's coming out on the 1st of August, is on Albany Records. It's 2 concertos. It's a violin and a viola concerto. And so that I'm really excited about that. That's Albany Symphony and David Allen Miller, and then the wonderful violinist Chi Yun, who's just incredible firebrand player, and Richard O'Neill, the violist.
Oh wow!
And it's just I couldn't be happier with that recording. It's been sometimes you sit around for a long time before a recording can happen. Those were particular ones. The viola concertos from 2002, and the violin concertos from 2008, and there have never been recordings of them. So it makes me particularly happy that that's coming out.
That's awesome.
And then I have 2 chamber discs, of which you are prominently featured on one of them, with two of the pieces, 2 of the pieces, and so those will come out kind of independently, but should be available in the mid-fall on Amazon, iTunes, all the usual places.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. Well, everybody's going to have to keep an eye out for those. And you had mentioned we have a clip from one of the pieces that's going to be coming out in the fall, 1,000 Cranes. Can you tell us a little bit about that piece?
Yeah, so that's on one of the discs. It's not exactly a chamber piece in a way. It's 17 strings and harp. The group Echo, which is the East Coast Chamber Orchestra, which is made up of friends from Curtis, that went out into the world and now are principal players, in all the orchestras around the country. It's kind of an amazing group of people. And so they do this, they, stand and they play. And so this group did that. The piece itself, 1,000 Cranes, refers to, I did this as a kind of dedication to a friend of mine who's from Hiroshima. And he always said, if you can do something to remember this place sometime, please do. And there are pieces that talk about the atomic bomb and deal with that subject, and they're obviously quite grim, like the Threnody for the victims of Hiroshima and so forth. But the way in I found to that subject matter was that there was a little girl named Sadako Sasaki who was in the middle of the blast and got radiation poisoning. And she, there was a kind of story that goes that if you fold 1,000 cranes, your deepest wishes and desires will be realized. And so she did this an act of faith. She did 1,000 cranes and she didn't get better. But her impulse was not to stop, but was to keep folding another 1,000 cranes. And there was something very optimistic about that, something, some belief in the creative process and in the idea of beauty transcending the most horrible. Like there's nothing you can say that will equal that horror. I can't write a horrible piece that would actually represent that. And that didn't appeal to me anyway. But the idea of saying something through that, her voice, made sense to me. And I think the excerpt that you have, it will be from that piece. There are 3 movements, and I think this is from the first movement, I'm not sure.
Great. Okay, so this is from 1,000 Cranes. Gorgeous.
Thanks, Ben.
And you said that'll be released in the fall, right?
That's right.
On
I'm actually
disc.
doing it on an independent label, so you'll be able to find it and stream it or buy it through Amazon or iTunes.
Oh, great.
Screens, yeah.
Yeah, I love it. So we are now past 5 o'clock. Sorry about that. But we have a few questions if you don't mind sticking around for a couple minutes.
Of course.
First of all, we've had lots of great comments about the piece. And Amira wants to know, how has the pandemic affected your inspiration for composition in terms of mood, choice of focus, choice of number of instruments in a piece, etc.?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I find myself needing to take in a lot of things which are good and not the news. And, you know, it's such a kind of a weird moment that you're disconnected from the horribleness of it unless you are dealing with somebody who you know who has COVID-19. It just seems like this thing that's reported upon, but it's not actually part of your actual life. And so it's this very strange disconnect. And I find myself just really needing sources of inspiration and consideration that are not about that or not about the political climate or anything like that. So, you know, poetry, art, you know, documentaries, any number of things kind of fill that. And those things provide metaphors and ways of thinking that I think are going to influence pieces for some time to come. I mean, the Siddhartha piece that I mentioned is, I mean, that story is about kind of awakening from within, from yourself, by listening to yourself and listening to the deepest parts of yourself. And I think, you know, if there's anything that's coming from this period, it's a little bit of that kind of self-reflection that hopefully kind of carries forward into all that you do. I mean, in terms of instrumentation choices and things like that, you know, that I haven't written the piece for 3 double basses and soprano yet, but you know, that could happen. And I mean, I think it kind of depends on those things. That instrumentation choices are not the thing. It's mostly about the sense of time that's reflected in that, the sense of calm and patience, and kind of, you know, what depth is, you know, spiritual meaning. Those kind of things are very much in my mind in terms of trying to get that somehow into the music, whatever that means. Yeah.
Well, it's fascinating. And I found myself doing sort of what you're talking about, looking to other things and other art forms and documentaries and things, and trying to find, you know, I think one sort of, again, silver lining of all this is that for a lot of us, I think there's time to explore maybe things we wouldn't normally have time to in our normal day-to-day lives, different musical styles, totally non-musical things, other art forms. And I found a lot of comfort in that.
Yeah. I mean, one person who's, you know, who I watched this wonderful documentary on was David Hockney, the wonderful visual artist who I've, you know, had some kind of passing obsession with in some other creative works with other collaborators and things. And he, I mean, the sense of both deep kind of still calm in him, but also the vividness and vibrancy of his work. And, you know, like that combination is something which really I'm thinking about a lot in this period, you know, how the electric color schemes and juxtapositions and weird depths and things that happen in his work create depth in a weird way, in a way that would, in other hands, might seem more about the surface, you know? And so things like that, I mean, they just force you to kind of stop and think about things for a while that you might not have thought about quite as intensely if you were living your day-to-day life normally.
Yeah, totally. Well, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for coming on and chatting with us and answering everybody's questions. And, you know, for everybody watching, I think I'll try to make sure that we get as much of the pieces that we talked about today broadcast either through the Symphony's social media channels or however is best, so that you can all check out the rest of those if you choose to. So thank you.
Ben, it's been a great pleasure and so great to see you again. And we'll be in touch soon, I'm sure, again.
Yeah, great to see you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.